What's gaming, gamers? Today, I've got a build for you using the Sunbreaker Titan subclass along with the Loreley Splendor Helm exotic helmet. This build is perfect in any level content, ranging from Vanguard Strikes to Master Raids and Grandmaster Nightfalls. If you play it smart, you'll be near invincible. As a quick aside, a build very similar to this is the build I used to get my solo flawless run of the Spire of the Watcher dungeon last season when it came out. So, if you're looking to solo flawless Spire, or any dungeon for that matter, this build will carry you through it as it did me. To get started with the build, normally I'd first describe the exotic, the Loreley Splendor Helm, but I think it important to instead first describe exactly what Sunspots do. A sunspot is a flame on the ground which, upon standing in one, grants you the Restoration ×1 buff, a passive 40% decrease to your super's recharge rate, and an additional 100% to the recharge rates of both your grenade and melee abilities for 5 seconds. Sunspots will also both deal damage and apply scorch stacks to enemies who stand inside it, applying 5 stacks every 0.16 seconds, which will ignite a target who stands in that sunspot for 3.2 seconds. With that, I can now get into the Loreley Splendor Helm and its perk, Cauterizing Flame. Cauterizing Flame, upon casting your barricade, will summon a sunspot at your position, granting you all of the aforementioned buffs. Additionally, upon becoming critically wounded, if your barricade is fully charged, a sunspot will automatically be summoned at your position, consuming your barricade charge and granting you all of the buffs you'd normally get from a sunspot. To get into your subclass, I'll put everything on screen as a prescriptive setup first, and once that's over, I'll detail each individual selection's pros and cons, as well as alternatives if there are any. Firstly, run the Hammer of Soul Super. Run the Rally Barricade, whichever jump you prefer, the Throwing Hammer Melee, the Healing Grenade, the Roaring Flames aspect, the Soul Invictus aspect, Ember of Empyrean, Ember of Singeing, Ember of Solace, and Ember of Torches. For your super, theoretically you can run either the Hammer of Soul or the Burning Maul super, but overall, I'm of the opinion that Hammer of Soul is better. Hammer of Soul is a ranged super, meaning you don't have to be hugging bosses or champions to deal damage to them, which is much safer overall, especially against bosses or champions with a stomp attack, as that has the potential to one-shot you even through your roaming super's damage resistance. Hammer of Soul has a shorter base duration, lasting 16.5 seconds instead of Burning Maul's 25 seconds. Burning Maul's light attacks consume 4% super energy per attack, and its heavy attacks consume 8% super energy per attack, whereas Hammer of Soul's hammer throws consume 9% of your super energy per attack. Overall, even with attacks taken into account, Burning Maul lasts longer, so if you're only using your super for its damage resistance, or maybe some ad clearing, Burning Maul can be the better option. If you want boss damage, Hammer of Soul is the better option, as you can damage the boss from a safe distance without having to worry about the boss's melee attacks. For your barricade, Rally Barricade and Towering Barricade both have their own uses. Rally Barricade has a cooldown that is 10 seconds shorter than that of Towering Barricade, and it increases your weapon's range, stability, and reload speed while standing behind it. Towering Barricade doesn't have any of those buffs, but will provide cover, so if you feel you need the Towering Barricade for its cover providing capabilities, use it. For any other use with this build, Rally Barricade is the better option, as the shorter cooldown means it will be off cooldown more often when you become critical health, thus allowing Loreley Splendor Helm to summon a sunspot at your position and grant you the buffs provided by the sunspot. It also grants you weapon buffs, which can be helpful when using the Rally Barricade manually to increase the reload speed of weapons behind it, increasing your overall DPS on boss damage phases wherein you have enough time to get a reload off. For your melee ability, Throwing Hammer is the better option. If the hammer is thrown and deals damage to an enemy, when that hammer is picked up, it will grant you Cure, which is a buff that instantly heals 60 HP. This is incredibly strong for survivability's sake, allowing you to survive being within melee range of enemies on higher difficulties simply by damaging them with your hammer. The Hammer Strike melee is fun in lower difficulty content, or when using other Solar Titan builds, but with this build being centered around survivability, Hammer Throw is simply better. For your grenade, you can use whichever one you want, really. I use the Healing Grenade, as it instantly grants you Cure, which heals you for 60 HP, and Restoration for 4 seconds. This is indispensable when you inevitably lose your hammer by missing a throw and throwing it off the map by accident, or if you can't get to it safely to pick it up. It's also incredibly helpful in the scenario wherein you find yourself critical health and your barricade isn't off cooldown, meaning Loreley Splendor can't summon a sunspot for you. Overall, I've gotten out of quite a few binds myself with the Healing Grenade equipped, and even if you don't use it for yourself, if you're playing group content, you can use it to heal teammates when they get low themselves. For alternatives, I'll talk more about this choice specifically when I describe this season's artifact setup, but as a little teaser, the Firebolt Grenade is a lot of fun this season. Onto the aspects, firstly pick Roaring Flames. This will grant your solar abilities increased damage while active, which increases with each stack up to its maximum of 3 stacks. Roaring Flames also works for your super and will increase its damage depending on the amount of stacks you have. Roaring Flames damage bonus is 20% with 1 stack, 44% with 2 stacks, and at its maximum of 3 stacks grants you a 73% damage bonus with your solar abilities. Additionally, while Roaring Flames is active, your unpowered melee will deal 30 Scorch, and for the purposes of armor mods, as well as the next aspect, will also count as powered melee hits. For that next aspect, choose Soul Invictus. Soul Invictus will, upon killing an enemy with a solar ability, killing a scorched enemy, or impacting anything with your Hammer of Soul super, create a sunspot at that location. This sunspot is the exact same as the one summoned by the Loreley Splendor Helm and provides the same buffs. Soul Invictus also has no cooldown, so as long as you're doing any of those things, it will create a sunspot, leaving everything ablaze. The Sunspots summoned by Loreley Splendor will grant you the same buffs as Soul Invictus even if you don't have Soul Invictus equipped, but the Sunspot creation and uptime is super important for survivability overall, and the alternative aspect option, Consecration, while fun, isn't great in most applications, and especially not with this build. With aspects out of the way, fragments are next. Firstly, Ember of Empyrean is really well suited for this build, as any solar kill, whether it be from a weapon or ability, will increase the duration of your radiant and restoration effects by 4 seconds. This both does well to increase your healing uptime, as well as providing you alternative options of keeping said uptime if it's not safe to get into the fray with your hammer. You can blink at enemies from afar with solar weaponry and keep your buffs up without relying on the sunspots. Both radiant and restoration's durations cannot be increased to above 12 seconds, but as long as you're killing at least one enemy every 4 seconds, you'll never lose these buffs. Ember of Empyrean does lower your resilience stat by 10 points, so keep that in mind when putting together your armor. Next, run Ember of Singeing. Ember of Singeing will grant you an additional 300% recharge rate to your class ability upon applying Scorch to an enemy, with no cooldown. This 3 seconds can't be increased at all, however. As an example, if an incandescent explosion applies Scorch to 3 surrounding enemies, you'll only gain 3 seconds of the increased recharge rate. It can be refreshed, however, and that means as long as you apply Scorch to an enemy at least once every 3 seconds, you'll constantly have the 300% class ability recharge rate, which means Loreley Splendor can proc more often. For your third fragment, run Ember of Solace. This makes your radiant and restoration effects last 50% longer, which is helpful for ensuring those buffs last long enough if you're killing a major or champion. Since I haven't said what it does yet, the radiant effect will cause all of your weapons to deal 25% increased damage, as well as granting them anti-barrier rounds if they don't already have another anti-champion mod applied. This is helpful for boss damage phases especially, or for killing enemies that are out of range if you're throwing hammer melee. Lastly, in keeping with the radiant theme, use Ember of Torches. This will grant you, as well as any teammates within 8 meters of you, the Radiant buff for 8 seconds upon dealing damage with your powered melee ability. With Ember of Solace, it will grant you Radiant for 12 seconds, but it will only grant this increased duration for allies if they are also in the solar subclass with Ember of Solace equipped. If they aren't, they'll just get the 8 seconds of Radiant. Ember of Torches also decreases your discipline stat by 10 points, so keep that in mind while putting together your armor build. For alternative fragments, there are a couple of options. Before I go over those options, however, if you do want to run any of these fragments, I recommend swapping on Ember of Torches first, and if you want 2 of them, swap Ember of Solace second. Ember of Solace is really strong, but in most content you'll be refreshing your Radiant and Restoration effects incredibly often, and the increased duration Solace offers may be wasted. As for the alternatives, firstly, if you're not running the healing grenade, you can run Ember of Resolve. Ember of Resolve will grant you Cure upon getting a kill with your grenade, which will heal you for 60 HP. This is the exact same amount of healing that the healing grenade provides, although it's slightly harder to pull off as it requires getting a kill with a grenade and it doesn't give you the restoration buff. But if you're already not running the healing grenade, it's going to slot in if you want something different. Secondly, you can run Ember of Ashes. This will make you apply 50% more scorch stacks to enemies, allowing you to ignite enemies 50% faster. This is helpful with boss damage especially, as the Hammer of Soul Super will apply Scorch via the sunspots it creates when impacting enemies due to the Soul Invictus aspect. Ember of Ashes also helps with weapons that apply Scorch, namely the Polaris Lance Exotic Scout Rifle, which I will talk about in more detail later in the video. Another combination of fragments you can run starts with Ember of Searing. This will summon a Fire Sprite and grant you melee energy upon defeating a scorched target, with no cooldown on the melee energy regeneration. Fire Sprites will grant you around 10% grenade energy upon pickup, making it an incredibly useful tool for increasing your grenade's uptime. Fire Sprites themselves have a 5-second cooldown, meaning you can only create a Fire Sprite every 5 seconds, but as you'll be killing scorched enemies constantly, you'll be effectively creating a Fire Sprite every 5 seconds. Ember of Searing also increases your recovery stat by 10 points, which is really good for this build, as that affects both the delay before you start regenerating health and the rate at which you regenerate health if you don't have the restoration buff active. The second fragment to complete this combination is Ember of Mercy. Ember of Mercy will cause Fire Sprites to also grant you restoration for 2 seconds, simply increasing your restoration uptime. Ember of Mercy also, upon reviving a teammate, grants both you and the revived teammate restoration for 5 seconds, which can be helpful for getting both you and that teammate out of a tough situation if they've died. Ember of Mercy also increases your resilience stat by 10 points, which will cancel out the 10-point decrease to the resilience stat caused by Ember of Empyrean. Ember of Mercy is really only helpful if you're running Ember of Searing, however, as it requires Fire Sprites, so if you're not running Searing, don't bring Mercy. But that's all for the subclass build. Now, I'll go over your artifact mods if you're playing during Season 20, the Season of Defiance. On screen, you're seeing the artifact setup I use for this build, so if you want to simply copy it, you can. To go into detail, however, for the first column, pick anything with Overload or Unstoppable capabilities. If you're running Ember of Torches, your powered melee attacks will grant you Radiant, which in turn allows you to pierce barrier shields with most weapons, thus not requiring any specific anti-barrier mods. For the second column, run the authorized mods for both solar weapons and grenades. These mods will decrease the cost of all armor mods affecting both your solar weapons and your grenades to a cost of 1 energy, simply allowing you to slot more into your armor. For the third column, run the Shatter Orbs mod, which will summon an orb of power upon destroying the shield of a combatant with a weapon whose element corresponds with that enemy's shield. Next, run the Solar Surge mod. This will grant you 1 stack of armor charge upon collecting a Fire Sprite. You won't be generating any Fire Sprites unless you're running Ember of Searing, or as you'll see shortly, the Firebolt Grenade, but if you are running either of those two things, Solar Surge is a good mod for granting you extra armor charges passively. For the fourth column, grab the Flare Up mod. This will cause your Firebolt Grenades to cause significantly more Scorch stacks, as well as summon a Fire Sprite upon damaging an enemy with the Firebolt Grenade. With this mod, the Firebolt Grenade will deal 80 stacks of Scorch, which means you'll be causing ignitions very frequently. Lastly, for the 5th column, first use the Rain of Firebolts mod. This will grant you a second grenade charge if you have the Firebolt grenade equipped, effectively doubling the uptime of your Firebolt grenades. For the last artifact mod, run Prismatic Transfer. This will grant your teammates 20% increase to their weapon damage for 10 seconds upon the casting of your super, so long as their subclass element differs from yours. Unfortunately, this damage buff doesn't stack with other damage buffs, like Radiant or Weapons of Light, but both of those buffs are 25% anyways, which is greater than the 20% granted by Prismatic Transfer, so nothing is lost. With the artifact out of the way, I can get into the armor build. I'll start with stat distribution. In the top 3 stat grouping of Mobility, Resilience, and Recovery, spec into Resilience first with Recovery second, and ignore Mobility completely. For the bottom 3 stat grouping of Discipline, Intellect, and Strength, spec into Discipline first, with Strength and Intellect both being stats you can do without. My armor has me at 22 Mobility, 90 Resilience, 60 Recovery, 92 Discipline, 42 Intellect, and 43 Strength. For your mods, I'll put a prescriptive setup on screen first, and then once I've set all the mods, I'll go into more detail on each mod, as well as alternatives if I feel there are any. Firstly, on your helmet, run 2 hands-on mods, and if you can fit it, a Harmonic Siphon mod. On your arms, run a Focusing Strike mod, a Heavy-Handed mod, and an Impact Induction mod. On your chest piece, run 2 Charged Up mods, and if you can fit it, a Harmonic Resistance mod. On your legs, run 2 Absolution mods, and if you can fit it, an Innervation mod. On your mark, run a 1-2 Finisher mod, and 2 Utility Kickstart mods. Now to go in depth with the armor mods. On your helmet, the 2 hands-on mods will grant you extra super energy upon defeating enemies with your charged melee ability. Exactly how much extra super energy I'm unsure of, but it is a significant boost to your super's energy, and as you'll be killing everything with your throwing hammer anyways, you might as well get some extra super energy out of it. The Harmonic Siphon mod will simply summon an orb of power upon rapidly defeating enemies with a solar weapon, which is a good passive increase to the utility of your solar weapons. For your arms, the Focusing Strike mod will grant you 20% class ability energy upon dealing melee damage to an enemy on a hidden 7-second cooldown. This is a significant increase to the energy of your barricade, which is really important to have up as consistently as possible due to Loreley Splendor Helm's requirement that it be fully charged. The Heavy-Handed mod will summon an Orb of Power upon getting a melee kill on around a 1-second cooldown. This Orb of Power isn't for super energy so much as it's for armor charge purposes, thus only 1 heavy-handed is required, as multiple copies of the mod only increase the potency of the orb generated, not the amount of orbs generated. Lastly, the Impact Induction mod will grant you 20% grenade energy upon dealing melee damage, and this shares the same 7-second hidden cooldown as the Focusing Strike mod. Importantly, none of these mods explicitly require you to use your charged melee ability to proc any of their effects, which means an uncharged melee will work perfectly fine to proc all of the mods if you find yourself without your hammer. On your chest piece, the 2 charged up mods will increase the amount of armor charge stacks you can hold. This is important as later on we'll be leveraging these armor charge stacks for ability regeneration purposes. The Harmonic Resistance mod will decrease incoming solar damage by 15%, which is a decent increase to your survivability against solar damage specifically. If you find yourself needing more resistance to a specific damage type, for example if you're running the Class 1 Nightfall Strike and you're taking a lot of void damage, forego one of the charged up mods and the Harmonic Resistance in favor of 2 void damage resistance mods. Having 2 of one specific damage resistance mod will increase your resistance to that specific damage type to 25%. Unfortunately, elemental damage resistance mods simply don't benefit from a 3rd copy, so it would be a waste to remove the other charged up mod in favor of another void resist in this example. For your legs, there are 2 setups from which you can choose the one that suits your playstyle more. Firstly, the one I run most of the time involves 2 Absolution mods. These mods together will grant you 7.5% energy to all 3 of your abilities individually upon orb pickup with no cooldown. This further increases the effective recharge rates of both your grenade and your barricade, which are the main reasons to run these mods. Additionally, run an Innervation mod. Innervation will grant you 10% grenade energy upon the collection of an Orb of Power, which is additive to the 7.5% granted by the 2 Absolution mods, granting you a total of 17.5% grenade energy every time you pick up an Orb of Power. This is the main way of recharging your grenade, and is incredibly strong for making sure your healing grenade is up when you need it. An alternative option to the Innervation mod, if you don't want the extra 10% grenade energy, is Recuperation. Recuperation will grant you 70 health upon picking up an Orb of Power, which is actually more than the cure granted by your grenade. It does involve the collection of an orb, however, so it's up to you and your playstyle whether having your grenade ready when orbs aren't readily available is better or worse than having the increased survivability when in the midst of a large group of enemies. For your Titan mark, first run a 1-2 Finisher mod. This will grant you a differing amount of melee energy upon finishing an enemy depending on the amount of armor charge stacks you currently have. With 5 stacks, you get around 95%, which basically fully refunds your melee ability instantly. This is important for the situation in which you lose your throwing hammer and have no means of survivability, as most of the build is centered around the hammer. Next, run 2 Utility Kickstart mods. Utility Kickstart will grant you class ability energy when your class ability energy is empty. This means that Loreley Splendor will proc Utility Kickstart, which is really good for the uptime of your class ability. I'm unsure of exactly how much energy is refunded per the amount of stacks of armor charge you have, as well as how much you get for each copy of the mod you have equipped, but it is a significant boost, and with how often you'll have armor charge stacks, you'll be able to constantly make use of Utility Kickstart. If you find that Utility Kickstart is using up your armor charge before you can get a finisher off to proc 1-2 Finisher and refund your melee ability, you can forego them in favor of any other mods on your class item. It is important for me to note, however, that the mods that require you to use your class ability don't proc when Loreley Splendor uses your class ability. You have to cast your barricade manually in order to make use of those mods. With the armor build out of the way, I can get into weapon choices I recommend for this build. I'll go over legendary weapons in the energy slot first, then the heavy slot, and finally some exotics I recommend that both synergize with this build and the solar subclass in general. In your energy slot, there are so many amazing solar weapons. I'll name a bunch really quickly with roles I recommend to accompany them, and then go into detail on a select few of them that have some other roles that are also good and unique in their own way. To start naming them, the Callus Mini-Tool Submachine Gun from the Season of the Haunted with the role of Threat Detector and Incandescent. The trusty Scout Rifle from the Deepstone Crypt Raid with the role of Perpetual Motion and Incandescent. The BXR-55 Battler Pulse Rifle from Dares of Eternity with the role of Demolitionist and Incandescent. The Zali's Bane Hand Cannon from the King's Fall Raid with the role of Explosive Payload and Incandescent. The Acacia's Dejection Trace Rifle from the Root of Nightmares Raid with the role of Perpetual Motion and Paracausal Affinity. And the Retraced Path Trace Rifle from Dares of Eternity with the role of Perpetual Motion and Incandescent. The Callus Mini-Tool Submachine Gun is currently not acquirable, but if you played during Season of the Haunted and have this gun, it is one of, if not my favorite weapon in the game. The role of Threat Detector and Incandescent really helps this weapon shine, especially with this build. Threat Detector will grant the weapon increased stability, reload speed, and handling when within the vicinity of one or more enemies, with being near 2 or more enemies increasing the weapon buff significantly. Incandescent is a perk that synergizes perfectly with the solar subclass, in that upon killing an enemy, it explodes in a burst of solar light, applying 30 scorch stacks to any enemies nearby to the one killed. This weapon is a powerhouse, and if you don't have it, I recommend keeping an eye out for either Banshee or Xur to be selling it, or to wait for next season when Bungie hopefully makes the patterns from past seasons acquirable. The BXR-55 Battler Pulse Rifle from Dares of Eternity is a weapon that is currently acquirable and craftable, which will allow you to put whatever you want on it. The role I usually run is Demolitionist and Incandescent, but Demolitionist isn't as important with this build specifically, so Perpetual Motion would also work in the third column. The Acacia's Dejection Trace Rifle from the Root of Nightmares Raid is a fantastic weapon and is craftable. This weapon has a plethora of perks that are really good. In the third column, Perpetual Motion, Envious Assassin, Reconstruction, and Rewind rounds are all good perks in their own way. In the fourth column, Frenzy, Target Lock, Paracausal Affinity, and Incandescent are also all good perks. Almost any role of this weapon that you get is at the very least usable, and I highly recommend running the Root of Nightmares raid if you can to get one. For heavy weapons, firstly there's the Fixed Odds Machine Gun from the Duality dungeon. This weapon is craftable, and when Duality is the weekly featured dungeon, it can be farmed at the Keitel encounter. As for perks I recommend, in the third column, Feeding Frenzy is the best and really only option. In the fourth column, Incandescent or Rampage are the best options. Next, there's the Crime Mutiny Grenade Launcher that was the Ritual playlist weapon during the Season of Plunder. If you didn't play during Plunder, this weapon is purchasable from the Monument to Lost Lights in the tower for 75,000 Glimmer, 100 Legendary Shards, 2 Enhancement Prisms, and 1 Ascendant Shard. This weapon has the role of Incandescent and Swashbuckler, which are 2 perks that synergize heavily with this build specifically. Grenade launchers don't do much damage on their own, but with Swashbuckler, this thing puts out some good numbers. Swashbuckler will increase by 1 stack for every kill gotten by the weapon, and at its max stacks, increases weapon damage by 33%. Swashbuckler will instantly gain 5 stacks upon getting a melee kill, and as this build uses the throwing hammer as a primary weapon, Crime Mutiny will very consistently be at that 33% damage bonus. Lastly, for heavy weapons is the Avalanche Machine Gun from the Dawning event. It's not currently acquirable, but if you played during last year's Dawning, or are watching this video during this year's Dawning, perks to look out for in the third column are Ambitious Assassin and Subsistence, along with the fourth column perks Swashbuckler, Adrenaline Junkie, and Incandescent. Onto exotic weapons, there are so many good ones that are really fun to use. The Tiku's Divination Bow, the Taraba Submachine Gun, the Hierarchy of Needs Bow from the Spire of the Watcher Dungeon, the Polaris Land Scout Rifle, the Devil's Ruin Sidearm, and the Skyburner's Oath Scout Rifle are all fantastic and fun options to run in the energy slot. I'd recommend Skyburner's Oath and Polaris Lance the most, however, as those 2 weapons apply Scorch in their own way, and applying Scorch is a big bonus to this build's effectiveness. With weapon recommendations out of the way, I can get into a playstyle I recommend when using this build. When entering an engagement, you want to get right in the face of a group of low health adds to start building up stacks of Roaring Flames, as well as creating Sunspots to get the restoration buff. Once you get Roaring Flames to its maximum of 3 stacks, you can start to take out higher health, higher threat enemies, as you'll be doing 73% extra damage to them. If you find yourself critically wounded with no barricade charge, use your healing grenade to instantly cure you and grant you that health instantly to keep yourself alive. But really, that's the entire playstyle. Use your hammer to kill enemies and recharge your abilities to keep yourself alive, and use your super for boss damage, the damage resistance it provides, or to simply clear out large groups of enemies really fast. And that's all for the build. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it and would like to see content similar to this, subscribe. I post 2 build videos a week, and subscribing will notify you when those go live if you'd like to see them. If you have any comments or constructive criticism, leave them in the comments. I read all of them and reply to most of them, and everything is appreciated. If you'd like to join our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs, I'll leave a link to the Bungie website as well as an invite link to our Discord server for you to join. Thank you again for watching, and have a great day.